Hi everyone, I'm here with Andrew Franks today, who's a bryologist and a botanist, and we'll tell you what that is in a second. So I hope you enjoy a little interview. Andrew, welcome to Woodfordia. How's it going?
Well, it's great to be here, get out of the house and sit underneath a tree and have a chat to you.
Yeah,
it's awesome.
And we've already noticed the little things that you're going to introduce us to.
Exactly, like just growing down near my feet, I can grab a little bit.
Yeah.
We'll be talking about moss.
Moss! Wonderful world of mosses, Andrew. Tell us firstly where your interest even started with regards to botany and biology, or looking at bryophytes, which are mosses. Tell us all about what's happened in your childhood that inspired you to do this.
Well, probably one of my earliest memories was I used to get into my mum's flower garden, and I used to get flowers and pull them apart and look at the different parts of the flower, the different structural parts when I was in primary school. So I guess from an early age I was interested in plants. Later on I thought that for a while I entertained the idea of being an architect. So straight after school I started doing architecture and didn't suit me. And then I found out that there was this field of science called ecology where you could go out and look at nature and get paid for it. And I thought that was just fantastic to go out and be in nature and look at the interaction between things and actually earn a living from it. I'd never realized that you could do something like that. So I think that's where my interest first peaked. So I ended up going over and doing a Bachelor of Science. And in my third year I was doing a rainforest ecology course. And I was looking at changes in the rainforest structure and composition with altitude. And it was down at Lamington National Park at O'Reilly's, and got up to the 1,000-metre mark with the Antarctic beech forest, the Nothofagus forest. And I was just wrapped that there's these massive old trees just covered in moss, and straight away I was thinking, what are these mosses? And so when I went back to Brisbane, I was a little amazed to find that there was no information about the mosses of the Antarctic beech forest. So I decided to do a third-year project documenting the moss flora on 5 Antarctic beech trees. And then that evolved to be my honours project, where I looked at some islands of these trees because they only occur at the highest peaks on the border ranges, and looked at the moss flora to see how the moss flora changed between trees and between islands of trees. And since then I've just kept my hand in, and then a number of years ago I got a job at the Queensland Herbarium, and the curation manager asked would I be interested in curating the bryophyte collection, and of course I said yes, because no one had ever curated it in, I don't know, many years, and it was in a bit of a mess. So I've been keeping my interest in bryophytes going. I've actually had a couple of paid consultancies to go and document bryophytes on people's properties, which has been pretty exciting. And I guess I should explain what a bryophyte is.
Yes.
So a bryophyte is a collective term for 3 groups of land plants, those being the mosses, the liverworts and the hornworts. And so together they're classed as bryophytes because they have a lot of similar features compared to flowering plants.
So what are the features of bryophytes as opposed to other plants?
Well, firstly, they're always small. So, this is quite a large moss, but they're usually quite small. They don't have a true vascular system as what we have in trees and the grasses and everything. They have a very rudimentary conducting tissue in them. The most interesting thing that they all share is that the sexual phase is called the gametophyte. So all of these are actually the diploid stage, the sporophyte stage, if you like. But these things, it's the haploid phase, the gametophyte, which is the dominant life thing that you see. So they all 3 share that. Always very small. They don't have any woody tissue, any lignin. They tend to because they don't have a vascular system, they absorb a lot of the water and nutrients straight through from the atmosphere, or what they can grab from any water that's on the surface. They produce spores instead of seeds. They don't have flowers. They don't have roots, because with higher plants, roots are a mechanism for not only anchoring but also absorbing water to get up to the leaves. With bryophytes, because they don't have a vascular system, they don't need a root system. So they have these things called rhizoids, which basically just anchor them to a surface.
So how long have they been around on Earth?
It's a good question. I've actually just been reading about this the past couple of nights. They are not very well representative in the fossil record. However, the current consensus is that they think that a bryophyte or a bryophyte-like plant was the first plant to make the leap from a freshwater system to land. So something like a bryophyte was the first one to make that leap to be a land plant. So they think that happened sometime in the Ordovician, which I don't know how many millions of years, hundreds of millions of years ago that was, but quite a long period. And the current thinking is that it's a monophyletic group, the bryophytes. So they had a common ancestor, and they're all evolved from that one common ancestor. And that's been something that's been a bit controversial over the last few years, if it's a polyphyletic group or monophyletic group. A polyphyletic group would be they all evolved separately, while a monophyletic group, they evolved from a single ancestor.
Interesting. And when you mentioned haploid and diploid, is that something that we could explain, just to understand a little bit the difference between those two systems?
Yep, it's a sex chromosome, so the number of sex chromosomes. So the diploid has diploid, so di meaning two, so you've got two sex chromosomes, while haploid you've got the one, so one N or two N is a common notation for differentiating between haploid and diploid. Now with the flowering plants, the haploid stage is the pollen and the egg cell. So you've got two haploid things, then pollination occurs and fertilization occurs, and then you get your diploid organism evolving in the seed. But with the bryophytes, you've got the haploid, and the sporophyte is the spores are the two N. The sporophyte is the diploid phase, and then it goes through meiosis, and you get your spores, which are one N again. So it's called an alternation of generations, that you've got your dominant gametophyte, and then you've got a sporophyte, which develops only after fertilization, which is a chance event anyway. And then you get through meiosis, and then spores are produced, and it goes through the cycle again.
It's so complex, isn't it?
It is.
The whole sexual development of plants and animals is really quite complex science. And being diploid or haploid, like that's a big division, as you're saying. Like it's a big division within the plant kingdom, because they're still part of the plant kingdom, just a different way of life, starting from how they reproduce all the way up to whether they're vascular or not. Fascinating little creatures, aren't they? And Andrew, so first of all I want to ask, how many people actually are bryologists in Australia?
Not many. There's only two paid bryologists at herbaria around Australia, and there's a lot of people like me who work at a herbarium, but it's not our primary duty to actually do any bryology. So it's I only get a small portion of my time that I can actually do it. It's not my core duty. So I can't call myself a bryologist at the herbarium, unfortunately. But any queries about mosses that come through, I'm the person they usually call up. That said, a lot of the botanists there at the herbarium still don't realise that what is a bryophyte. They'll call me up and say, we've got a bryophyte down here, and I'll walk down and have a look, and it'll be a lichen.
Yep. That's a whole other area, isn't it? It's like the fungi and algae, like even lower lower, I guess, the beginnings of Earth, things coming onto Earth were algae at the beginning from oceans. And so that's like a totally different ballgame, and yet looking quite similar. And so, a lot of people will make that, it's really hard to tell sometimes. And I find that those distinctions are not made really in science very early on when we're studying biology as well. And that's something that becomes confusing in the end for a lot of scientists. And I feel like it's an area that's sort of hidden. The lichenology and bryology is such a hidden, because the minutest things that
Yeah,
kind of get forgotten because we look at the big picture.
exactly. And it's that, just recently they've been talking about plant blindness.
Oh.
So people not noticing the plants around them, and I think it goes a step further with the bryophytes. It's like they're just totally invisible to a lot of botanists. They'll see the trees, but they won't see the bryophytes growing on them.
Yep. And so with what is the ecological role of bryophytes?
What do they do?
Yes.
Well, it's they've got a lot of different functions. For one, if we think in more areas where there's snowfall, like up in the northern hemisphere, the sphagnum bogs actually absorb a lot of snow melt after the winter's finished and the snow starts melting. So sphagnum is a pretty unusual moss in that it can absorb up to 60% its weight in water. And so when you've got masses of this sphagnum bogs, it'll absorb a lot of that moisture from the snow melt, and then what it doesn't use in photosynthesis, it slowly releases into the environment. So it basically acts as a intermediary. If they weren't there, you just have a mass of water flowing out from the snow melts. In tropical rainforests, when we've got a lot of bryophytes in there, and in mountains with the cloud forests and things like that, again they absorb a lot of moisture straight from the mists, the incidence of mists, and they'll absorb a lot of that moisture and use as much as they can. But because they've got no regulation of that moisture, there's no stomata or anything, they're losing a lot of moisture back to the atmosphere. However, because they have absorbed it and are releasing it slowly, they're increasing the humidity underneath the canopy in rainforests. Because they have a bit more moisture, they also hold seed banks, so they're like a fantastic little way for a lot of seeds that are dropped from the canopy might land in a little thing of moss, and because there's a bit of moisture there, they can germinate and start growing.
Cool.
They tend to be some of the primary colonizers on disturbed areas, so on cuttings, road cuttings and track cuttings, you tend to find bryophytes growing as one of the early colonizers, and it destabilizes the soil. They're an important component of the cryptogamic crusts in semi-arid areas. So the cryptogamic crust includes things like the algae, the fungi, the lichens, the bryophytes, and it's that little microbiotic crust that sits on the soil surface and binds the soil surface. And it's a very important part of the Australian ecosystem in that our animals, our native animals, are soft-footed, and so they didn't break that cryptogamic crust, but when hoofed animals like sheep and cattle were introduced, they broke that cryptogamic crust, and it led to soil erosion.
Yes, so very important sort of beginnings of understanding how soil and plants interact.
Yep.
Very interesting sort of analogies there, and I feel I love the idea that it's like a little nursery for other plants to have their seed drop in and receive those nutrients and moisture. And how do they gain nutrients, like from the atmosphere as well, or is it through that rhizome system?
Probably a little bit of both. They have been finding a lot of mutualisms with fungi as well. The amazing world of fungi.
Yep.
So they probably absorb a little bit through the sort of interactions with fungi. And also with just water, for example, if there's a moss growing on the trunk of a tree and it's raining, you're getting water flowing down the trunk, which is collecting nutrients as it goes, and then that water goes over the moss and it'll absorb the nutrients from that water straight into their membrane. So yeah, there's a couple of different ways that they get their nutrients.
So if somebody wanted to be a bryologist and decided, okay, this is the career path I want to take, what would be some of the steps they would take in order to really study these plants?
Some of the steps, well, don't be scared, is probably the main thing. A lot of botanists get intimidated by bryophytes because they just think they're too hard to study. But if you look at any of the plant groups, each plant group's got their little quirks. The grasses and the daisies, they all have different terms for the different parts of their flowers and things like that. The bryophytes are exactly the same. They've got their own unique terminology, And once you start looking at things underneath the microscope, you'll start to see these different structures and get familiar with their terms. You also need to have access to not only a dissecting microscope but a compound microscope, because you do need to look at the cellular level in the leaves. So they're a little more tricky to deal with, but I don't think they're any more difficult than any other group of plants around. I think if I was an undergrad and wanted to work on bryophytes and none of the academic people around knew much about them, I'm sure that a lot of the academics would be dissuading people to actually work on them. And I've been finding that a lot of universities have actually stopped teaching anything about bryophytes. A lot of them used to talk about plant diversity and go through the algae and the bryophytes and then the ferns, gymnosperms and the angiosperms. But now it's more focused on food productions and things like that rather than looking at that. So I think you need to just make a contact with some people who can guide you with studying these things, and don't be afraid of trial and error. I'm largely self-taught, and I would say it took me a while to get confident with my producing going through keys and being happy with my identifications and everything. And it's just, spending the time and persistence and doing that.
Yes, and in terms of that, that there's this lack of now education makes it even more important, I feel, because this is such an important part of the so ancient part of the ecosystem. And I just feel like we need to encourage young people to get interested in the small things again, to understand that they are the beginnings of larger life existing on Earth.
Exactly. And when you think about it, the angiosperms have got the greatest diversity of plants, and then after that you get the bryophytes. So the bryophytes have got more diversity than the gymnosperms and the ferns together. So they're the second most diverse group of land plants after the flowering plants.
Wow.
And not many people are looking at them. So we're sort of ignoring a large chunk of our diversity.
Yes. And tell me, Andrew, how much do we know about Australian bryophytes? Given that there's hardly any researchers actually studying them,
yes.
What do we know about them? Are they considered in, development assessment before development happens? Is this something that's an issue?
We don't have anything at that level. In Queensland, I can speak that we don't have any bryophytes listed underneath the Nature Conservation Act, so none of them are classed as endangered or vulnerable or rare. For many years it was because of lack of information, but I think we've got a lot more information now and can make those judgments that we do have some particularly rare mosses that should be conserved. So yeah, I think they're not considered in the same way as higher plants, and yeah, I think it needs to be dealt with, and because there would be a lot of rare mosses and liverworts out there that should be on the list but aren't, and given that same treatment as higher plants.
And how many species have been identified in Australia, and how does that compare to other places in the world?
Well, that's a good question. From the top of my head, I can't really say how many species we have in Australia. I know in southeast Queensland we've got about 600 species of moss, maybe 200 species of liverwort, and just a handful of hornworts. Worldwide, it's somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 species of moss, around 7,000 species of liverwort, and 600 species of hornwort.
And that's currently identified?
Known, known species.
Yeah. So then we don't know really what's out there that we don't know yet.
No, that's right. So we have in Australia probably about, I think it's around 90% of the moss flora has been treated under the Flora of Australia. The liverworts are lagging a little bit behind. I reckon it's probably around 15% done. And hornworts, it's such a small group anyway that they tend to be lumped in with the liverworts.
Interesting, very interesting. So Andrew, I'm going to be so interesting. It would be so great to look at some of these plants and learn how to identify them a little bit. I guess it's probably better to show and tell rather than tell, I'm assuming.
Sure.
Yep. So how about we go for a walk, have a
Yeah.
look what we can find, and you can tell us more about these fascinating little plants.
Okay.
Andrew, just before we go out into the field, can we have a look at some of the books you brought with you to show us a little bit of what these creatures look like, so we can actually get a better understanding just from books, and that's something that people can actually do by books if they're interested in studying this world of bryophytes.
Exactly. So there's only a few field guides around there, around the bouts. This one is a field guide to the mosses and allied plants of southern Australia. Now, allied plants tend to be liverworts and hornworts, so instead of saying bryophytes and having people look blankly at me, I often say moss and moss-like plants, because people have a perception of what a moss is. So this is one field guide that's been produced by David Marr and Bruce Frewer, but it's mainly for southern Australia. There's a few species that do occur in Queensland, and usually has a nice overall photo of the general habit. Sometimes David's done a bit of a rough sketch of the leaf shape in the margins as well, and a description. So that's a pretty useful field guide. I usually throw it in and take it out with me if I'm going in somewhere. Then when I'm getting serious with my identification, I've got to use this with the mosses. So this is the key to the Australian genera of moss. So it's a dichotomous key. It's quite lengthy. I think there's over 400 couplets in there. Heavy on the terminology, but the illustrated one's got some great photos of the different taxa that have been used in the key taken by the Malcolms. So that's another very useful document. And because the terminology for identifying mosses is so particular, and you really need to have a glossary. So this is my pride and joy. This is, whenever I'm doing my IDs at home, this is close at hand. And it's an illustrated glossary, so it's got some fantastic micrographs in there, and illustrations for illustrating the different parts of the moss plant.
Wow.
So it's like my little Bible. So yeah, that's another one. It's done by the Malcolms, which is they're based in New Zealand. A couple of New Zealanders. Fantastic book.
Great.
What else have I got? If you want some general books on mosses, there's some great ones like this one, Gathering Moss, by a North American bryologist, talking about her experiences with moss. Has some great stories in there about mosses and bryophytes, so that's another good one to keep an eye out for. What have I got? Oh, I picked up this one late last year from a bookshop down in Melbourne, by a Scandinavian author. So it's about mosses and bryophytes. Sort of a really general. It's difficult to sort of pigeonhole. There's some descriptions of species in there, but it also goes into sections on moss gardening and moss cultivation.
That's wonderful.
So yeah, if you see that one around.
Yep. So how can people get into that?
I don't know. It's something that I've been wanting to get into, is making terrariums, moss terrariums, and trying to get the lighting right. So I've got a couple of data loggers now that I want to set out in different areas to record the light intensity and the temperature range, and trying to get the humidity right in these terrariums. Yeah, because they just look fantastic when they're done properly.
Yeah, that'd be such a wonderful way. Also, maybe looking at conservation, some of these species, to get people growing them in their own little terrarium at home.
Exactly. Now we are trying to work on something like this for Queensland. So this is an illustrated catalogue to the Tasmanian mosses. So it's illustrated by a bryologist called, his name is Rod Seppel, and he's based down the Gold Coast. He's a fantastic botanical illustrator. As you can see, a lot of detail in these illustrations.
Beautiful.
So he's recently retired to the Gold Coast, and he wants to do something similar for Queensland mosses. So we're slowly working our way through Queensland mosses, getting them illustrated, and hopefully we'll have some of these produced in the near future. If you're interested in reading a novel, there's Elizabeth Gilbert's, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. She wrote this book called Signature of All Things, and the protagonist in there is a bryologist. So as you can see, it's got some nice mosses on the covers. So if you want to read a story about biologists,
That's
there's
such
that
a
one.
wonderful thing to
It's
inspire
awesome.
people with.
Yeah. And then a friend of mine went overseas earlier this year, over to Japan. And as a thank you gift for looking after his swimming pool, he brought me back this fantastic little Japanese field guide. So all the names are in English, but all the descriptions are in Japanese, unfortunately. But it's still a fantastic little field guide for some of the Japanese mosses. Now, the Japanese really take their bryophytes seriously.
That's interesting. They must be part of the cultural
It
heritage
is.
to look at the small detail of things.
Yeah, and in Kyoto they've got a moss temple, and
Oh.
so they take their bryophytes a lot more seriously than we do here in
We
in
should have a
Australia.
moss temple.
Exactly.
We should
And
build one.
they employ people to actually weed the grasses out of the moss lawns. And,
So you mentioned earlier as well, when we had a discussion before we did the interview, that you could have a lawn,
yes,
a moss lawn, which you wouldn't have to cut.
that's right. So in some areas of North America where I guess the conditions are right, some people have ripped up the grass for their lawn and actually put down moss as their lawn. So because moss only get about this tall anyway, there's no need to actually mow it.
Yeah.
It'll be permanently green and at a set level.
Yep. And how is it easy to sort of cultivate mosses on the ground? Like if you wanted to do a patch in your garden, would it have to have special conditions like moisture and all of those things?
You would. A lot of mosses are quite particular about the substrate they grow on. So that moss that I picked off the ground, it'll only occur on soil. You won't find it on trees. So yeah, don't go picking mosses off trees and expecting it to grow on the ground.
Of course.
I've got a species of moss in my backyard that grows happily on, it seems like, on rock, on soil, on concrete, on an old leather boot. So there are some that occur on a number of different substrates. So you have to be aware of what substrate you're trying to grow it on, and then you have to get the conditions right. So making sure that the light, the humidity, the temperatures are within that range.
Yep. So mimic the environment from which you picked it up from.
Exactly.
Yeah. That sounds lovely. It'd be great to grow some mosses.
I reckon.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Wonderful books. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.